G'day everyone, it's Matt from Crank Engineering, and I've got to put together a custom seat for this bike that I'm working on at the moment, and I really want to learn how to do some very basic upholstery. So I want to cover this seat with some foam and then trim it with a diamond pattern stitching leather seat. And proof of concept, I've tested some stuff out and sort of works. These diamonds are too big, but we'll get there. But that's a pretty advanced project for someone who has zero sewing skills, which is me. So I'm going to do an intermediate project in between. I'm going to make a bar stool, which will give me a chance to practice using my tubing bender, and also to do some sewing and make a cover, a diamond stitch cover in leather for a bar stool. So that's what we're working on today. Let's get into it. So the first step was to mark out the diameter of the base on some plywood. So simply measure it all out and use a compass to draw the size of the disc straight on the plywood. And there's a lot of different ways you can cut this out with a saber saw or table saw or something else, but since I had a bandsaw, I just zapped it out with the bandsaw. And once that's done, I just used a belt sander to sand it as close as possible to the pencil mark on the disc. And since this is construction grade plywood, it didn't hurt to give it a sand. So some 80, 120 and then 240 grit sandpaper really smoothed up the surface. Now I wanted to have a mark on both sides of the foam where the disc was supposed to be. So I just used a wooden skewer, pushed it right through the center of the foam and used that to center the plywood disc, and then marked around the disc. And then a standard kitchen bread knife was used to do the major shaping of the foam and just cut off the big wedges that were accessible easily in preparation for the next step, which was to go back to the belt sander and use that to smooth off the foam surface. Now this took a long time. It was about half an hour of sanding to get the final shape that I wanted. And using the disc again with some dividers set to 12mm, I've just scratched in the shape of the disc with a 12mm seam allowance and then started to cut it out. And then just using the lines on the cutting mat, mark in the diamond pattern on a 20mm centers. So I've just flipped the board to see if there was any use with the lines on the back, but it turned out not. So just gone back to the first side and whatever looked good by eye, marked out the diamond pattern straight onto the leather. So here's a look at how the treadle operates. This is under the machine, and where I'm pressing down with my hand is where your foot would be resting. So as you can see, where my finger's pointing on the right there's a crank, and if you get the right motion of the treadle, you can make that big, it's a flywheel slash pulley, and you can see the leather belt that travels around that pulley up to the machine up here on the top, and that leather belt is what's used to drive the machine. Now you can see there that I've accidentally gone in reverse, which is also pretty easy to do, but once you get a bit of a rhythm happening, it isn't too difficult, and I just have one foot resting on the treadle, and I really use my heel to do most of the work. And I've seen different videos with different techniques, 2-foot techniques, single foot techniques, but this is what seems to work pretty well for me, and it quite happily drives the machine as fast as you can treadle it. So for this project I used a straight 100% polyester thread, and while it looks intimidating to thread the machine after 4 or 5 goes and following the manual every time, it becomes a bit of a habit. This machine's only got 2 adjustments. That was the stitch length, and this is the tension for the thread. So I picked up 2 packets of different leather specific needles, and this is the material that goes underneath the leather cover. So it's a polyester batting or wadding, and I've just cut a disc out and backed it with a piece of cotton bed sheet. This is supposed to stop the threads pulling through the polyester batting. And here we go, stitching the quilting pattern on the leather seat cover. So simply a matter of following the pencil lines and repeating about, well, I think it was 40 times, the 40 stitches I did on this seat cover to get the quilting pattern that I wanted. And as you can see, I've come back after dinner in the dark, and now I'm just trimming up all those scraps around the perimeter of the seat cover itself. and it's time to start looking at the skirt that was going to go around the perimeter of the seat base. So I figured I'd try and clamp it together just to help me hold it in place a little easier, and use that while I was running the first couple of stitches in the skirt. If you've got a keen eye, you'll have noticed I've unpicked that row of stitching I did in the last shot, and I'm just trying something a bit different here. The way I've laid this out will give me 4 rows of stitching on this joint, and 2 will be on the outside and they're visible, and I just did that for some visual appeal of that seam. And we're back now to join the skirt to the top. So again, I tried to use some stationary clips here just to try and hold the 2 pieces together, and I'm actually turning this over by hand. I'm not using the treadle. I figured the treadle would move the machine way too fast for me to be able to control what's happening on this joint. So I was aiming to keep the edge of both pieces of leather aligned perfectly on the joint. You can see under my left hand here the end of the skirt approaching the needle now. So I stopped a little bit short so that I could trim this cover or this skirt to exactly the right length. So I'm just overlapping them and putting a little cut mark in the pair of leather pieces so that I know exactly where that seam is supposed to be. I'm using that for alignment. So I'm just trimming off the excess here, and then trying to figure out how I will line it all up and get it under the needle to sew up that final seam. And now that I've done a test fit on the foam cushion, just going back and doubling up that seam around the perimeter of the cover just to increase the strength of that joint. So I'm just running a parallel line of stitching. Now I'm using the treadle because I'm really just following the existing line of stitching and doubling it up. And it's time for final fitment. So obviously the painted surface of the base, the plywood base, is facing up, and I'm using my Arrow hand stapler here, which did a pretty terrible job, to be honest. I had to follow up with a hammer to punch the staples all the way in, which was a bit disappointing. So I'd grabbed this light duty electric stapler, which funnily enough did a great job. It just smashed through the leather and the plywood base and was very quick as well. And there you go. That was a quick introduction to the project and set me up for success for my next one.